Hello everyone. Today I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Phil from the Sovrin Foundation. He's the chairman of the Sovrin Foundation, and Sovrin happens to be one of the projects that I personally am extremely interested in because of the various real life utilities that they have. So I'm really looking forward to this interview. So Dr. Phil, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks. I'm good. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So I think the first thing I should ask you, and like a lot of people want to know, like what exactly is Sovereign? Like, can you give our audience like a primer on it?
Yeah. So, so I think of sovereign as the internet for identity. And what I mean by that is if you think about how the internet works, it's a public, decentralized infrastructure that anybody can use to send messages to anybody else. And of course, those messages are very flexible and very nobody says what messages you can send or what messages you can't send. You can make up new protocols. You can do anything you want. The internet makes sure that that happens. So Sovereign's trying to do the same thing for identity. What I mean by that is we're trying to build a decentralized, public, global identity system that is not only decentralized in the sense that no one owns it, but decentralized in the sense that people can determine what kind of identity information they want to exchange. Sovereign just makes sure that it happens reliably and in a trustworthy way without without trying to dictate exactly what's happening on top of it.
Awesome. So, when I was going through your white paper and when I was going through your website, there was this term that was used a lot. It was self-sovereign identity, SSI. So, like, what does it mean and why is it so important, especially in this day and age?
Yeah, so it's an interesting term because it does. I think it's very descriptive, but it also causes some confusion for people because we kind of have this feeling of what a sovereign is, right? Oh, the sovereign's the king, or the sovereign's the country, or and so the term is really meant to indicate that where people have some kind of control over their identity, and I say some kind of control because it's not total control. Because the only way you can have total control over your identity is to live on a desert island.
Right.
Right, because you have relationships with other people. They know who you are. They can say things about you, and all of those could be considered part of what you might think of as your identity, and you can't control, the attributes that other people assign to you and those kinds of things. So I like to think of self-sovereign identity. I like to think of it as defining a border, and in the same way that a country has borders, and within those borders, the country is free to do whatever it needs to do, right? Outside of those borders, it has to interact with every other country as a peer. Right. Same thing's true in self-sovereign identity. It defines a border, and within that border, the individual gets to control things, and outside of that border, they have to interact with other people and other organizations as peers. So, an example of what do you get to control? Well, you get to control who you share things with, right? In a self-sovereign identity system, my data is under my control and I determine who I'm going to share it with. But when do I have to act with somebody else as a peer? Let's give a real world example. I might walk into a pharmacy, say, and want to pick up a prescription, and they'll say, we need some form of ID. Right. If I pull up my Starbucks coffee card, they're going to say, this isn't acceptable. They're going to say, no, we need this kind of ID. So in that instance, what's happened is I'm making choices about what I'm presenting, but the other party is also making choices about what they'll accept. And that negotiation is at the heart of what self-sovereign identity enables. Because when you put people in a position where they have a negotiation to make, now they have a lot of control over what happens. Doesn't mean you can force the other party to accept your Starbucks coffee card to pick up a prescription, but it does mean you could decide, I don't want a prescription bad enough to divulge my name, and you could walk away. But it's not happening in the background. It's not happening without your consent. You're the one that's in charge and in control of that.
Interesting. So it sounds very self-empowering and extremely powerful. So my question to you is, why will the government allow something like sovereign to take over the identity layer? Like, how do you see that panning out?
So Governments, as I think your question implies, governments have this kind of foundational role in what we think of as identity, right? When we think of the foundational identity documents, they're things like birth certificates and passports and driver's licenses, all of which are issued by governments. But governments don't really control identity in the world. They control some of the documents that we use for identifying people. Mm-hmm. Same thing can be true in Sovrin. So the government can use Sovrin to issue a passport. They could use Sovrin to issue a birth certificate. They could use Sovrin to issue a driver's license. So it doesn't cut them out of what they've always done.
Wow, okay.
It actually enables them to move what they've always done in the physical world into the online world. So we've already had quite a few fruitful discussions on this. The state of Illinois has already announced that they're going to start issuing birth registrations, birth certificates, on top of Sovrin. And we've had other discussions with other states, I can't name them right now, but about doing driver's licenses on top of Sovrin. The government of British Columbia has a project called the Org Book. And the Org Book is essentially business registrations, another kind of identity that the governments are involved in. And so, they're putting business registrations on top of Sovrin. So these are all, instances where governments are using Sovrin the same way they'd use the internet to
Right.
enable what they've always done. They can use Sovrin to enable what they've always done. So I don't expect that we'll get a lot of pushback.
So you feel that it'll be more of a synergistic, collaborative relationship?
Yeah, I do. The thing that's important to understand about Sovrin is, unlike most identity systems that we're familiar with, Sovrin isn't an identity provider. Right? We don't provide an identity to anyone. We don't provide any documents to anyone. What we do is we enable everybody who already does identity documents to provide those documents. So I think of it, if you think of something like Facebook Connect, right? That's a identity system, and Facebook is essentially the identity provider. That's the term that people use, right? And what that means is that Facebook is keeping a centralized database of all of their users and all of the attributes. And when you use Facebook to log in, they're authenticating that it's you, and that then they share certain attributes out. In Sovrin, let's classify what Facebook does as single source identity. Right? They're an identity provider, and there's a single source of identity, Facebook. And of course, Google does the same thing. They're a single source of identity. Microsoft does the same thing. They're a single source of identity. In Sovrin, what happens is everybody can be a source of some identity document, even individuals. And so Sovrin is a multi-source identity system where multiple parties can issue identity documents, credentials, right, on top of Sovrin, and then an individual can use any or all of those credentials in any kind of identity situation to prove who they are, to prove attributes about themselves, and so on.
Okay, so speaking of the mechanism, can you tell us why Sovrin opted to choose for a public blockchain? What was the thinking behind using a public blockchain to run the Sovrin system?
So Sovrin, like I said, we're trying to build a public identity system. So we felt like the whole system needed to be public. It needed to be open to anyone to be able to use for any purpose that they wanted, rather than just people who have a business relationship with us or something else. So it's public in the sense that everybody can use it, and so the ledger needs to be exactly the same. It needs to be public.
Okay, so another interesting thing that Sovrin is doing is implementing zero knowledge proofs. Can you tell us how zero knowledge proofs will act out in this system, so to speak?
Yeah, that's actually a really important concept. So the Sovrin is not only built to provide a global identity system, but to do it in a way that protects people's privacy. So one of the things that I think is important to understand is if you're going to have a self-sovereign identity system, as we talked about, that implies that you've got some amount of control. And control implies privacy. Because if you don't have privacy, you don't have any control.
Exactly.
Right? Once your information's out there, how can you say you have any control over it? So privacy is a bedrock principle of what we're trying to do with Sovrin. And part of privacy, one important part, is minimal disclosure. So when you ask me for information, let's say that, again, let's just go back to the pharmacy example.
Sure.
Right? You're a pharmacist, I'm an individual coming in, and I need to pick up a prescription. When you ask me for an identity document, I could give you a driver's license. It has all kinds of stuff on there, most of which you don't care about. Right? Probably what you care about is matching the picture to a name so that you know that the prescription that has my name on it is the same person that's standing in front of you so that you can give me the prescription. You don't care about my address. You don't care about my phone number. You don't need to know my birth date. You don't need to know where I wear glasses. You don't need to know what kind of cars I can drive. None of that is relevant. But if I just hand you the driver's license, you have all of that information. Now, of course, in a physical transaction, I show the pharmacist my driver's license. I don't expect a human to be able to memorize all of the information on it in a glance and then correlate that with some other big database. But if I provide it to you digitally, of course, computers are very, very good at this. And so, the computer can now say, oh, good, you gave me all of this information off your driver's license. I'm going to use it to validate this transaction, and I'm just going to save away all of this other information so that later on I can use it for something, right? Maybe a good purpose, maybe a nefarious purpose, we don't know. So the point of minimal disclosure is to only disclose to people the exact attributes that they need. And that's what zero-knowledge proofs do. Zero-knowledge proofs allow me to have a credential. Let's say it's a driver's license, a digital driver's license in Sovrin. And I now online, right? I'm not in a physical pharmacy. I'm online, and somebody says, we need you to prove that you're over 18 before you engage in this transaction. I prove that I'm over 18 without disclosing any of the other information on that driver's license, including the birth date itself. I can just prove to them that I'm over 18 because that's the only thing they need to know. And so we feel that minimal disclosure is a very important part of the privacy story, because in order to preserve as much privacy as we can, we have to, not disclose all of the information that happens to be available on any given credential.
Interesting. So, there was one more thing that I came across when I was reading the white paper, and one thing that really, really made me extremely fascinated with the project was the concept of DIDs, or decentralized identifiers. I really want you to tell our audience what decentralized identifiers are, and why is it better than the universal identifiers that we use in today's ecosystem.
Sure. Yeah. So there's actually quite a bit to unpack there. So as you said, a DID stands for decentralized identifier. It's not unlike a URL or a URI in that it has some given structure, and that structure is used by computers in order to decode it and figure out what it is, just like a URL. The thing about URLs is that they have domain names in them. And basing your self-sovereign identity on a domain name can be dangerous. And the reason is because you never own a domain name, you only rent them. And that domain name could be lost, right? You don't pay your bill, for example, you lose the domain name. Now somebody else could pick up that domain name and impersonate you because they have the domain name. And they can be you, essentially, because all your identifiers are based on something that is reusable. So one of the important bedrock principles of identifiers in an identity system is you want them to be non-reusable, right? You want them to be permanent. So once I give you an identifier, I never reuse it for anybody or anything else. And so DIDs are designed to do just that. They are just a long string of digits, essentially, that's designed to be unique. And what happens in Sovrin is that long string of digits can be looked up on the ledger.
Right.
So that's why it's an identifier, and that's actually the primary purpose of the ledger. Is you give me a DID, I can say, oh, I want to look this up, because that's the first thing you want to do with an identifier is look it up.
Right.
In the past, we've always had to look them up in some central directory somewhere. Right. So some company runs some directory, we go look up this identifier. With Sovrin, you go look it up on the ledger, and of course the ledger isn't centralized; it's run by multiple nodes and distributed. And what you get back is you get back what's called a DID doc, so a decentralized identifier document. And a DID doc is a JSON structure. It's signed. It contains a public key that's associated with that DID, and possibly more than one public key, but at least one public key. And it also contains endpoints, the agents, where you can actually go and interact with the entity that this DID represents. So that's the basics of DIDs, right? You give me a DID, I go look it up on the ledger, I get back a public key, and I get back an endpoint, which could be a URL. And now I can go to that URL and interact with you, do whatever it is that needs to be done. DIDs are also important because we create a new DID for every relationship that you have. So this is called pairwise pseudonymity. And the idea is that every time you create a relationship, let's say you create one with your employer and you create one with your bank, you're going to give your employer and your bank different DIDs. So they have different identifiers for you. Right. And this is a key idea in privacy. So we talked about minimal disclosure. The other key idea in privacy is non-correlation. Because if I use the same identifier with my employer and my bank, now my bank and my employer can talk behind my back and say, hey, what about this guy, using the common identifier that they have for me? You know, the world is full of common identifiers, phone numbers, social security numbers, national health IDs. All of those things are correlatable universal identifiers. We don't want to build an identity system that's based on that. And so DIDs allow us to create as many of these identifiers as we need. So an individual like you might have thousands of DIDs that are representing each of the individual relationships that you have.
Right. From a user experience point of view, like for somebody like my mother who's not that technologically adept, like how will the UX be for her if she wants to use Sovrin?
Yeah. So Sovrin, the Sovrin user experience is based on wallets or agents. We technically we call them edge agents, but most people are probably going to think of them as a wallet, right? And the user experience isn't going to be that much different than using a password manager or something else on your mobile phone. It'll feel a lot like that, right? So, and usually what's going to happen is you're going to be interacting with someone in a specific context. So let me make something up off the top of my head, right? You go to your bank and you go to log in, and they say, "Oh, who are you?" And you give them an identifier. Now this could be through some browser extension. It could be because you scan a QR code. There are lots of different ways that could happen. But you identify yourself. They're going to know who you are now, because they're going to say, "Oh, this is a DID that we recognize. We have a relationship with that DID. Here is the public key for that DID." And now they're going to behind the scenes interact with your agent on your phone. Right. And you could have it set up so that when you contact your bank, it automatically logs you in. You could have it set up so that you have a button on your phone so that you say, yes, this is really me logging into my bank. The point is that from most people's perspective, it's going to be a lot easier than username passwords. But the experience is going to feel like using your mobile phone, and the phone agent is essentially going to keep track of all of the DIDs, right? You're not going to have to remember thousands of them yourself or write them down. Anything it'll all be automated.
So it's a very high level of abstraction, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So when I was one more thing I came across while I was reading about the Sovrin protocol, you guys talk about a marketplace of trust. That's what the Sovrin protocol wants to create. So I want to ask you, like, how do you see this like, how do you visualize this panning out in the future? This entire marketplace that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept, because there are different levels in this trust network. So what Sovrin does is it does something very basic, right? When you use Sovrin to exchange a credential, I mean, we can go back to the pharmacy example. Right? Mm-hmm. What is Sovrin proving? Sovrin is guaranteeing that when you look up the identifier, you're going to get back the DID doc that's associated with it. Right. When you use the public key, it's a public key that's associated with that identifier. It's taking care of the base level kind of infrastructure, that the doc hasn't been tampered with, that the credential is correct. When you use a credential, say, I'm going to prove to you that I'm over 18. It's proving that the credential hasn't been tampered with. It's saying who the credential was issued by. It's proving to you that the credential is about the person who you are interacting with. That's what Sovrin does. Now, that's not enough. Right? It's a lot, and it's an important foundation, but it's not enough. Because let's say, let's change the example a little bit. I'm at my bank, I'm applying for a loan, and they want to know that I'm employed and I make over a certain amount. Right? So I'm going to give them a credential, and I'm going to prove to them that I'm employed and that I make over a certain amount. And Sovrin's going to ensure that they know that that credential hasn't been tampered with and that it's about me. Mm-hmm. And it's going to tell them the entity who issued the credential. But what they don't know is that entity who issued the credential a real business? Right? Sovrin doesn't have anything to say about that. Right? So this is what we call the secondary trust layer. Right? The trust that has to occur within certain domains. So these domain-specific trust net areas are really important because they exist already, right? There's already a way, for example, for the bank to say, is this particular company a real company? They go to the state registration site, they can look that up. If they really need proof, they could ask for documents from that business. There's all kinds of ways that we already have in the real world to do this. So what Sovrin does is we allow all of these domains to create their own domain-specific trust framework on top of Sovrin, so that there can be an employment verification trust system. Right? And that's not, Sovrin doesn't run that because this is a decentralized system, right? But in the same way that the internet allows multiple different parties to connect, it doesn't say they all have to connect in the same way. It allows them to connect in specific domains. Sovrin does the same thing. It allows you to exchange identity credentials. It provides a base level of functionality, but then it allows domains to be built on top of that. So we believe that there are going to be, hundreds, thousands of these different kinds of domains that are going to up that will be able to essentially provide reputation in a way, right, about certain things. So for example, it may be that that a independent organization decides we're going to create the schema for what an employment verification looks like, and then employers can use that schema. But in order to use that schema, maybe the employers have to sign up to some legal agreement that says we'll use this schema, and in order to do that, we're going to prove to you certain things. And now this independent organization is essentially saying, yes, this is a real business. Right? So that's the way that trust works in multiple levels and in specific domains.
That is extremely fascinating, and thank you for making it so clear to us. So the one last question I want to ask you before we move on to the user questions, like for
Sure.
reader questions rather, is can you tell us how the Sovrin token economics will work? Like, how will the token work in the ecosystem?
Yeah. So the Sovrin token, the primary reason for creating a token inside Sovrin goes back to this idea of credentials, we're trying to create a multi-party identity system, a multi-source identity system. And these identity documents, the credentials, are at the heart of that. And these documents already exist, right? The real world is full of multiple credentials that businesses issue every day. Now, some of those credentials you get for free, or at least very low cost, because they have some utility that's needed. So, for example, you might have an employee ID badge from your employer. You didn't have to pay your employer for that. But some of them actually have quite a bit of value. So a good example of that is when a bank does know your customer process, what's typically called KYC. Right? They're required to do this legally for anti-money laundering purposes. And they spend a lot of money doing this, right? It's not cheap to do a KYC process on a customer. Now, let's say that they gave you a credential and said, "Oh, we're going to give you a credential that proves your name and that we checked your ID and that you live at a certain place and you have this passport." I mean, they could do all of that because they did that as part of their KYC. You walk down the street, you use that credential to open up an account at the competitor bank, and now the competitor bank has all of the work that the other bank did for free. So what would be the natural response? The natural response would be, well, we're not going to issue credentials about that because we don't want our competitors using this information. On the other hand, there are probably plenty of instances where the bank wouldn't care if you use that credential. You know, if you just want to prove your address to a shipping site, for example, the bank probably doesn't care. So all of that goodness that could come from having a verified credential from the bank gets lost because they're afraid that their competitors are going to take the effort that they put into that credential and use it against them. So the answer to that is what we call premium credentials. Right. That is credentials that have a price tag associated with them. And so now what happens is the bank may say, we're going to give you this credential, you can use it, and sometimes when you use it, like let's say at a competitor bank, they're going to require a price before they unlock the proof. Right? So you use it to prove things about yourself, and in order for the relying party, the other bank, to actually use that data, they'll have to pay the first bank some amount of information, some amount of money. Right. Now, in order to make that kind of marketplace, in order to make credentials work, we felt like we needed a marketplace for credentials. Right. And in order to make credential marketplace flexible and fast, and actually avoid some technical issues like escrow, we felt like we needed to have a token inside the network to make that happen. So that's what the token primary purpose is creating this marketplace for credentials, and we think it's a important part of how the entire sovereign ecosystem is going to develop.
Interesting. So let's move on to the reader questions. So the first thing that one of our readers wanted to know is, like, can you give us a overview about the partnership between Sovrin and IBM?
Yeah, sure. So, IBM, of course, needs no introduction. Large company, well known, well respected. So the primary relationship between Sovrin Foundation and IBM is that they are a sovereign steward. Let me explain what that means. So Sovrin's ledger is public, but it does use known validator nodes. And so those known validator nodes are run by organizations around the world, large and small, and those organizations are called stewards. And so IBM signed on to be a Sovrin Foundation steward, meaning that they're going to run a validator node in the Sovrin network. They're also an important partner in terms of just their reach in the blockchain space. And they're already providing a lot of introductions and a lot of interesting use cases around how we can use Sovrin in different ways. So the main thing is the stewardship, but I think you're going to see other things develop over time as IBM starts to use Sovrin within various processes and businesses that they have and start pushing it out.
The next question is about more of a comparison thing. How does Sovereign measure up to Uport, which is built on the Ethereum blockchain, and what are the advantages that it has?
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting you pick Uport because it seems like there's probably a new blockchain-based identity system announced every week, and most of them I don't really have a lot of respect for technical. I mean, I don't know any people, but just looking at the technology, I don't necessarily think they've done that good of a job of designing the identity system. Uport is an exception. I have a lot of respect for the Uport folks, and we talk to them all the time. We know them. We have regular conversations with them. They're using DIDs. They're using verifiable claims. Sovereign's using DIDs and verifiable claims. One of the things we talk about with them is how can we create more interoperability between the two systems. And they're also concerned with privacy. I think it's a great project, and I'm very supportive of it. Now the difference is Sovereign is primarily aimed at this point. This isn't a technical issue. This is more of a business model issue. Right? Sovereign is aimed at existing businesses like banks, and we have partnerships with CU Ledger. We just talked about IBM. Another one of our stewards is Deutsche Telekom through their T-Labs project. So there's quite a few business partnerships that we have because we believe that creating these multi-source identity credentials around the things that people are doing is important, and that's where we're focused. Uport is using kind of some of the same ideas, right? DIDs, verifiable claims, ledger-based identity. They're primarily focused right now on the Ethereum ecosystem, dApps, and doing identity for that. It doesn't mean that either project is stuck in those worlds, right? But that's kind of the difference. Is right now we're focused in different areas. I think you're going to see a lot of interaction and a lot of cooperation between Uport and Sovereign in the future.
That's pretty amazing. So we're gonna wrap up this interview with the two questions that we ask everyone that we interview. First and foremost, who is somebody in the crypto space that you admire immensely and would like to see us interview next?
Yeah, so there are a number of people who I admire in the crypto space, but I think that the guy that comes to mind first is probably Vinay Gupta. I don't know if you've already talked to Vinay, but he's an amazing individual. He has, his thinking process is always so interesting, and he has a very expansive view, I think, of what distributed ledgers, blockchains can do to change the world. And so I have a lot of admiration for Vinay.
That's really interesting. We'll reach out to him for this. And finally, the final question that we want to ask you is, do you have any parting words for our audience and for anybody who's interested in Sovereign?
Yeah. So, I think the thing I'd say about Sovereign and people keeping an eye on it is just there are a lot of interesting things around identity. I like to say that identity is one of the foundational technologies that we use to build the world. We don't think so much about it in the physical world because it's built into us, right? We recognize people. We kind of have this, anonymity most of the time, but that doesn't mean we're not recognized. It's all built in, and it's all part of how we work. Online, we haven't had a really good way to do it. I've been involved in the identity space for a long time. I've run Internet Identity Workshop along with Kalia Hamlin and Doc Searles for the last 13 years. We just got done doing our 26th Internet Identity Workshop. We started IIW with the idea of working on what we called user-centric identity back in 2005. And self-sovereign identity is really just an evolution of all of the ideas that have come through the user-centric identity world. And when you think about that, that's hundreds, thousands of people thinking about how to make identity work online for decades, right? And that kind of gives you an idea of just how hard this problem is, because we've made some progress. Things like OAuth and OpenID Connect and UMA are amazing, but I don't think they have gone as far as we can go, and that's what I think is interesting about Sovrin. Is I think it's the next evolutionary step along that path, and it's going to provide people with a brand new way of thinking about how they do online identity, and that's going to change a lot of the interactions we have.
That's a very wonderful way to end the interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Phil, for taking your time to do this. We learned so much. And personally speaking, I'm, like I said in the beginning of the interview, I'm a huge fan of your project. I'm a huge fan of the work that you guys are putting into it. And just thank you for doing this. So it was a lot of pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. So that was Dr. Phil, and Sovrin is such an amazing project, and I'm glad that I got to learn so much. And the idea of storing self-sovereign identity on a public blockchain can be truly revolutionary, especially when you think that we are living in an increasingly transparent world where our privacy is more often than not compromised. So that is why it is very, very important for us to support projects like Sovrin, and I hope you will agree with me. So if you like what you just saw, then like and share the video with all your friends, and just please subscribe, because you're going to interview more amazing people from the blockchain space. And on top of that, you can always follow us on coinlive.io, and you can also follow us on Twitter, that is at coinlive_io, C capital, L capital, IO capital. We give to you unbiased, actionable, objective news, and I'm pretty sure that if you're in the crypto space, you will find a lot of value in it. So this is Raj from CoinLive, signing off.